Britain's railways exist because of a rather shameful secret, and that's a rather bold claim to make. But on this channel we've talked a lot about the life of the navvy, the people that built these railways, the gruelling work conditions that they were under. But there is another tale that we should consider.
With the statue of a 17th century slave trader pulled down.
Century slave trader has stood for more than 120 years.
So in recent years there's been a surge in trying to understand a not very well documented aspect of the railways. In fact, if I wanted to make this video a few years back, well, the lack of information I had would have made this impossible. My bookshelves are full of railway history. I've walked lines, traced their routes, uncovered their stories, dates, decisions, hundreds of railways and thousands of stations. See, all of this history, well, it really does matter, but it's not the starting point. All of this was a result of something else happening first. Now, when you take a step back and you try and understand that early development, how railways came into being, I don't mean all this ingenuity, but that's when we run into our first problem. So the question for us today isn't how they worked as such, it's how they ended up being paid for.
By the early 19th century, times were changing. People were demanding faster, more efficient ways of moving goods, people from A to B across the whole country.
The logic was kind of obvious in essence, but what wasn't obvious is how these were going to be financed. It's something that would have cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, maybe even more, before a train had even run. We can name the engineers, we can name the landowners, the Acts of Parliament, all very well documented. But when it comes to the origin of where these really large sums of money comes from, well, that trail pretty much disappears. Not because it wasn't important, but because at the time it wasn't being questioned. So 1825 saw the first passenger carrying railway, the Stockton and Darlington. Of course there are other claims to that, but nevertheless a huge turning point for the era of the railways. Now, for those of you that like to know where I'm walking today, well, I'm actually walking on a very old GWR branch line, 1860s I think it went, from the Hampshire and Berkshire extension line all the way round to Marlborough itself.
The railways started to progress at an unseen before pace.
And what followed became known as railway mania. But of course the foundations for this were laid a lot earlier.
Within just 20 years, the nation went from one small mining line in the northeast of England to having huge infrastructure work. You had the Liverpool and Manchester, the Selby and Leeds, you had the London to Birmingham, the London to Southampton, and of course you had what became the Great Western Railway. And they came in great succession, and the competition to get lines built as quickly as possible meant that investors were needed to provide as much money as possible.
Hugely important period, and it determined how Britain grew thereafter. So that brings us back nicely to that question, because if the technology was there and the demand was there, we know that from the canal era beforehand, well, where exactly did this money come from? Because the amount of money required wasn't incremental, there was an instant demand. The answer doesn't sit in the 19th century at all. It reaches back centuries earlier. Now, only recently we started to look more closely at this, and it's not to assign blame, it's not to rewrite history in any way, it's simply to understand.
To recognise that some parts of this story were really long overlooked, but that doesn't diminish the progress that was made. It simply provides us with a fuller picture of building the railways that we don't often think about. As early as 1102, the Council of London, in conjunction with the King of England, decreed, "Let no one dare hereafter engage in the infamous business prevalent to sell men as if they were animals."
Now, on paper, that position never fully went away. If you dig through the records of following centuries, you find reaffirmations of that position. Slavery was indeed illegal in England, but in practice, Britain found a way of holding two positions at once.
By the 18th century, Britain as a nation was deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade. But how, when that was something that was illegal in the UK and had been for centuries? Well, the justification that they used was simple. If people were enslaved outside of the UK, those legal precedents set in the 12th century couldn't be upheld.
Slavery was unacceptable at home and yet enormously profitable abroad. Have a look at this, an old GWR bridge 1860s, I believe, this particular one. It's seen better days.
And this cruel contradiction surfaced time and time again in Parliament. Advocates like William Wilberforce, and then later in more significant rulings by Lord Mansfield. And his ruling stated that slavery was unsupported by English law.
And yet, at the same time, enslaved people were being transported across the world under the British flag. Pressure built for decades. In 1807, Parliament passed a Slave Trade Act, formally abolishing the trade throughout the British Empire, but not freeing those already held. Further legislation followed. 1811, another act was undertaken to try and close some of these loopholes, but it would take until 1833 for slavery to be completely abolished under the Empire.
That summary barely even scratches the surface of what is a complex and very uncomfortable history, but it does provide us with something, and that something is really important. And that's context.
You see, these legal shifts, they didn't just change lives at every single level, they moved vast amounts of money, and the timing here in this story is absolutely key for this. Now, this 1833 Act would be crucial here because it contains something in it which would have hugely long-lasting consequences, because it talked about what the landowners would get as compensation for what that law prior to this point had recognised as their property.
To do that, the government had to take out a £20 million loan. Now, we're not talking £20 million in today's money. We're talking £20 million back then, which today would be worth somewhere in the region of between £2 and £4 billion. That money wasn't to compensate the victims of slavery. That money was to compensate the slave owners for the inconvenience of no longer being able to exploit other human beings.
And we don't truly know the scale of this. It wasn't until 2015 that this loan was fully paid off. That's 180 years after that act. University College London have undertaken a study to try and find out more about this. They built a database of where the money went and, crucially, what happened to that money.
As the University College of London database continues to grow, patterns are starting to emerge. As it currently stands, it identifies 487 separate railway investments made by 175 separate individuals, all of whom had received compensation as a result of the Abolition of Slavery Act.
Together, those investments totaled £5 million, spread across 200 railway companies. This isn't the full picture, but it's enough to show that the money released by abolition didn't vanish, it just moved. And a significant proportion of it flowed directly into those railway companies that were dramatically changing the shape of Britain at the exact same moment.
The legacy of the railways starts with the effort of the engineers, from Trevithick and his work with steam, to Brunel's early innovations, and Stephenson and his development of railway lines and early tramway systems.
And without that early ingenuity, well, of course, Britain's railway story would have unfolded much slower. Ideas are great though, but what's more pertinent is laying track and the cost of it. And this is where individual names begin to matter. One of them is John Moss. Now, Moss came from a family deeply connected with the slave economy, and the records of the UCL database indicate compensation money formed part of the capital he later invested in the railways. By the standards of the time, his involvement was substantial. He served as a deputy chair on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and later as the chair of the Grand Junction Railway. In both cases, he wasn't a passive investor. He was part of a decision-making structure that determined whether the lines were built at all. Without Moss's backing, or that of others like him, some of these early projects may never have progressed beyond paper. A broader look at the UCL database shows this pattern happening again and again. These payments, these compensation payments, are very much propping up in investments all over this early railway era. It's woven into this financial structure of these early railways.
But how many railway projects from that time were funded in some way as a result of a connection to slavery? Well, it's estimated around 29%. So on average, nearly 1 in 3 railway projects had a connection to slavery funding.
That financial part, though, is only one aspect to this. There is a deeper story here too. We also need to think about how these railways were used and where their early development happened with regards to the actual demand at the time.
When you look at the regions of the UK that embraced railways as early adopters, they're very, very often in industrial areas, which is because People needed to be able to shift in their raw materials and shift out their produce as quickly as possible. Therefore, there was a huge incentive to get railways moving in those areas.
And the most important of those raw materials, cotton.
Throughout the period of railway mania, much of Britain's cotton supply was coming in from America, a country that still used slaves to produce those goods. Although abolition had happened in the UK and some of those funds had been used to fund the railways, there was yet more income and investment coming in from slave ownership, albeit not even through British hands.
This doesn't make railways unique at all. It makes them sat exactly where they were sat at the time. The part of this new globalisation, part of this massive period of transition, shaped very much on decisions long before the first rail was eventually laid. There will be many people, I am sure, and I understand it, that are divided by this. It feels like you're trying to rewrite a history, or you're being a bit woke or a bit left wing. It's about none of that. It's just simply about understanding an aspect of history. Until very recently, this part of railway history has either been avoided or simply left out of the story altogether. I don't mean hidden in a conspiracy sense, I just mean that the information wasn't there in one study. Those questions weren't being asked for that to be able to happen. For me, this is simply another piece of the past worth acknowledging. Another layer in the bigger story, and it's definitely not about blame or judgment or about revisiting the past with a modern moralistic sense of righteousness. This was always wrong. It's about taking the opportunity, now that we have better evidence, to see the 19th century more clearly than we could have before. For me, making these videos, well, they're always about sharing something that I've learned and my journey of learning that I share with you. And if you really enjoy these videos, speaking of which, well, we do have all sorts of extra bits and pieces on offer, where if you want to click on the join button and sign up to a monthly membership, we have Patreon as well, which is exactly the same thing. We've got behind the scenes videos, we've got a Discord server that everybody will enjoy that turns up, and I'm chatting in there every day with all of you lovely members and Patreon people. But if that's not for you, carry on watching, click subscribe, click like, and we'll see you this time next week.
Don't you dare do that thing where you do it in the other angle and then chop it all the time.
Deal with it.
Hate it.
Deal with it.
I'm going to be doing that.